This is one man's alarmed vision of the future. A future which he felt might, with such dangerous ease, be brought about.
Well, that was the opening sequence of the BBC's play of 1984 by George Orwell, produced in 1954. It showed Britain under a totalitarian government and British people operating the machinery of a police state to keep their fellow Britons down. It starred Peter Cushing as Winston Smith, a government worker who disobeyed the rules and fell in love with Julia, a fellow government worker, played by Yvonne Mitchell. Andre Morel played O'Brien, the state official who took their case in hand, interrogated and tortured Winston, and finally broke his spirit. It's interesting that though George Orwell's novel had been on the bookstalls for 6 years when BBC took it and turned it into a play, yet it was television that made it notorious. It released a flood of bitter reproaches from outraged viewers, and the press made front-page news of this with their customary zeal.
Tortures on TV start biggest protest story. A television play last night shocked the nation. It brought the biggest flood of protests the BBC...
Storm on TV horror. Hundreds of angry viewers telephoned the BBC.
MPs say TV panders to sadism. 5 Conservative MPs have tabled a motion in Parliament.
Reeks of decadence and corruption. So said Jonah Barrington in yesterday's Daily Sketch.
Blood on his face. Viewers say one of the play's stars, Peter Cushing, crippled in untold...
Rats from sewers. Twice rats were shown running around in cages.
Repeat, sadists.
Well, over the last few weeks, Michael Dean has been speaking to a number of the principal people involved in 1984. And first, the man at whom very much of the public barracking was aimed, the director, Rudolph Cartier.
Were you prepared for the violent audience response you got when 1984 was first produced?
Not actually. We were a bit surprised ourselves. When the play was scheduled, we knew we would have some sort of reaction, but as it was the usual Sunday play, and at that time the audience were used to strong stuff, to a big, strong play on a Sunday, we expected some sort of reaction, but what happened the next day was beyond our expectations. In every pub, in underground buses, in clubs, there was only one topic, 1984, and the rats, and the violence in it. And all the papers had headlines that one should ban this play and one should sue the BBC. It's a situation similar to the situation now.
Well, I was working on the BBC staff in those days, and it was just a routine job. It had been lying around as a proposition for some time, and I think it was felt they could tackle it as a technical job. Television had just sort of expanded to being able to take on an epic, and this was viewed as one.
Had you read the book? Were you familiar with most of Orwell's
Oh,
books?
no, not all of Orwell, but I knew this book very well. And I was very keen to do it. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a dare. It was biting off quite a lot at that time.
You see, we did the whole thing live, but we filmed 2 little bits.
Yes.
And one was an outdoor bit, and the other was which was not used in those days, but it was a piece of Alexandra Palace. For some reason we went there, although it was after Alexandra Palace's time. And there was in fact a canteen there, and we were dressed in our boiler suits for this scene where the prole behind the counter says, them's with salt, them's without, them's with salt, them's without, or something to that effect, and you've got your lunch and you've got one with salt or you've got one without.
Well, now, come on, please. Them stew with salt, them stew without.
Then we actually, keeping our boiler suits on because we hadn't finished the scene, we actually went to the canteen at Alexandra Palace for our particular lunch, and there was a woman saying, them's with sugar, them's without, them. We thought, what? We're in it already. We really are there. Yes. And then began the fright that not only could it happen, but there was the beginning of it.
Well, I knew it was disturbing because it was the truth, you see, and I think that's what scared people. I mean, almost 80% or even more percent
of what took place in 1984 had actually taken place in the world, because Orwell was a bit of a prophet, and it only needed that extra 10% to make the whole thing true. And I think that's what scared people when we got all this tremendous press and arguments and telephone calls going on that it should never have been done. And it was the truth, because you can do all sorts of things. If you like to mention, say, anything like Frankenstein, that is impossible. That could never happen. So therefore, you can go and be scared, but you know it can't happen. But 1984 can and could still happen. I think that's what scared people, and one felt that in the script and indeed in the playing. Indeed.
Well, not that most of those who complained would admit that it frightened them. Here, from over 2,000 letters and telegrams, is a typical response.
Last night's play insulting to people's intelligence. Shocking bad taste on Sunday night.
And here's the same thing said at greater length.
No, we are not ostriches with our heads buried in the sand. We've all come to the conclusion that the persons responsible for putting on the play are sadists and readers of horror comics, and we, the public, will work to get television censored as the films have to be. For weeks on Sundays we have to watch dismal, immoral, and sadistically highbrow plays. Thank God for Wilfred Pickles and the Grove family.
Another writer, a schoolmaster who might be thought less likely to thank God for the Grove family, was no more grateful for 1984.
I do not think anyone could argue that the play was obscene to a degree, and quite unsuitable for the vast audience to which it was playing. Some of the topics discussed were quite revolting to any decent person, and certainly struck at the root of everything a respectable school tries to teach. It's quite true that one could turn the instrument off, which in fact I did, but this only accentuates the harm done in the eyes of an adolescent audience, and I think one is entitled to believe that the BBC will not televise such a play.
But they already had, and furthermore they repeated it. More letters, more telegrams.
Strongly protest against repetition of play 1984.
And more bluntly,
stop repeat of Sunday's horror.
The play's defenders replied in kind.
Please repeat 1984. No doubt some have forgotten Belson.
And we'll give the last word to a group of professionals who were sharp enough to see that an attack on Orwell could be interpreted as an attack on them.
As professional writers, we have the deepest respect for the technical achievements, and as members of the public, we have the greatest admiration for the courage required to say something, however grim and unpleasant, which still needed to be said. We can only assume that the people whose complaints received so much publicity would make ideal members of a 1984 society, since obviously they are chained to TV sets without the strength of mind to turn off a program they don't like or the ability to appreciate anything more.
I was completely astounded at the vehemence of the outcry against it. I think probably what upset people so much was the thought that it did take place in England. I think if the locale had been somewhere else, then they wouldn't have been quite so upset. But it was, I think, the public reaction, the anti-reaction, was caused quite largely by the fact that the locale was England, and that this could happen in this country. People didn't want to believe that at all, and I think it upset them to think that it could happen.
It was rather exciting that people had taken so much notice. And then after that, which was more exciting still, suddenly, the critics on every newspaper had said, this is dreadful, this is awful, this shouldn't be allowed. And then the next day the editors were writing editorials saying, quite against their critics, this is the most marvellous thing, the BBC grows up.
You had to repeat the performance again live.
Yes, on the Thursday.
In the suddenly tensely charged atmosphere of all
yes,
this.
And then we knew everybody would be looking, and then it was frightening, not because everybody would be watching us, but because the floor manager and someone else, I've forgotten who, had threatening letters that if we did it again, they would blow us up. And we had CID men all over the place, and we were terrified, and we kept on looking at stagehands thinking, didn't see him last time, he wasn't here on Sunday, do you think he's got a bomb, and all this was going, it was absolutely terrifying. Terrifying.